Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another Historical Humans podcast. And my name's Justin Woods. I'm joined today by my fellow co-hosts, Colum Coleman and Aaron Gilpin. And today I am out in South Dakota for work, so I figured this would be a great time for us to cover the Dakota Wars. Not like we've had this topic planned for almost a year.
Yeah. Yes, the Dakota Wars, famous for not taking place in Dakota.
And there's a lot of good reasons, and I will gladly go into that history, but let's just jump off right from the top, eh?
All right, yep. So I'm going to start us off with a very fast-running list of names because this conflict, it doesn't get taught too often, but when it does, it's under one of like eight different titles here. And that makes it pretty hard to track down. So you might have heard of it without realizing you've heard of it. So we're going to run with that first, real quick here. The Dakota War is also known as the Dakota Uprising, the
Ooh.
Sioux Outbreak of 1862, the Sioux Uprising, the Dakota Conflict, and Little Crow's War,
I
Very
which
don't
is my
like I don't like the sound of the Dakota outbreak because it makes it sound like they're a disease. That's
I mean, when you're settling new lands in the western part of the Northwestern Territory, you know, them indigenous. No, I think it's interesting because a couple of them can tell you exactly where the thought process was in general sentiment. Like the Sioux upper or the Dakota uprising. That's a good one. That's very true. The outbreak, the
yeah,
Sioux uprising, the Dakota conflict. I mean, there's very softening language around it in a lot of ways.
yeah. And to be fair, personally, I think the Dakota conflict is probably the most accurate nomenclature wise for what happens, as this is effectively 6 weeks of border raids, is this war. And that personally seems like less of a formalized war and more of a massive skirmish.
I see. That's where I actually think I would disagree with you because it's usually called the Dakota Wars, plural. Because this, what we're talking about here, is just a brief insight into it. There's a few additional other conflicts that I don't have the names for off the top of my head. Maybe I can look up, but that happened as a precursor to this and are oftentimes conflated with it when taught about. Um, but it's very interesting. But it was a series of skirmishes. The wars were a series of skirmishes that took place, and the Dakota, for their part, the reason they did a bunch of border raids was purely to harass the settlers and to annoy them enough that they're upset, but not sending in the full mobilized military, which does eventually have some military conflict, but it they're not going to dedicate a massive amount of resources if only a few dozen people are getting a hit, you know?
Yeah.
like they're trying to maintain like a bandit level.
Kind of, yeah. It really is guerrilla warfare.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
really.
Un- Unfortunately for Little Crow, who will be blamed for everything that happens in this entire podcast, uh, unfortunately for him, there does happen to be about halfway through this a mass exodus of people, which gets the U.S. Army's attention.
Well,
He he's a
suffering
little
from
too good at the
success.
job.
Yeah, suffering from success when you're too good at what you're doing.
Yeah. One of the stats we'll cite later is he manages to successfully drive 20,000 settlers from their homes, which was the largest of any Native American conflict to date. So he was seen as big problem number one.
Okay, I did pull up some of the other ones that were conflated with the Dakota Wars that also are included. Sorry, just to
Yeah,
follow back
no,
up.
no, no, go for it, go for it. Like we can talk a little bit about because this is one of those topics that like kind of gets tumbled around with other things, and it's hard to pick it out just by itself.
So you're going to notice a theme here, but it's the Grattan Massacre, which occurred in 1854, the Fetterman Fight in 1866, And then these happened afterwards, but are still usually conflated. The Battle of Little Bighorn, which we might talk about at some point. We want to do a Last Stand series. Um, there's the Battle of the Rosebud, which happened in 1876, and the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. So there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of additional history. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. Yeah, and well, let's see who's fighting these wars anyway, right? We gotta meet our players here. The United States government is, of course, one party involved. It's always the United States government.
It's always the British.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other side of the war is known as the Eastern Bands of the Dakota. And the collective name that I was given during the research phase of today's topic is that the bands in question were known as the Santee Sioux. That was another name that they would be referred to as a sort of an umbrella term. And so you have two very imbalanced contenders here.
And part of the background and part of what led to everything happening was a lot of this war took place in Minnesota, even though that's not exactly where they're originally from. The Santee were originally from northern Wisconsin, and you know if you're anything of a geographer, you know that northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, they're fairly close, but they're not the same place. And this actually came because of a lot of encroachment in other indigenous territories. There was kind of a domino effect that tribes that got pushed out of northern Ontario and the Northeast ended up moving further west themselves. So you had the Iroquois Confederacy that had a bunch of people displaced, and this effectively had like I said, a domino effect where the Ojibwe that were in northern Ontario and upstate New York ended up basically just shifting to northern Wisconsin and displacing the Dakota. The Dakota ended up going further west into Minnesota, and here's where we have the issues because it didn't last long, and here come the settlers.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's gonna get pretty bad really fast here.
Because if one displaced population knows something, that when a bunch of people that are a little bit different start marching in, it doesn't usually have a positive outcome, at least in this context.
Yeah, the outbreak of the war was kind of a building up of pressure that eventually just popped the gasket and everything collapsed. There are several factors that contribute to the war. The first of these is there's a depletion of natural resources. The Dakota rely on game for both food and fur trading. This game is growing increasingly scarce. This is because there are now more people in Minnesota than ever before in history. And most of those people are making their living off of the fur trade.
Well, yeah, that's one aspect of it was the fur trade kicking in and people start pushing for those hides because again, they used to do the fur trade in like upstate New York, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in parts of Illinois, but then they started just completely eviscerating those populations. And even further, when the settlers were coming to these areas, it took a while to get the farms and fields prepared. They would have to cut down the trees and other vegetation that was there, and growing seasons do happen. So, how do you support yourself while your food is growing?
Yeah.
You hunt for game, and if there's an entire population already trying to survive off of game, when you double or sometimes even triple that, it puts a lot of negative pressure on the land, especially like the American bison that was very prominent in these regions. Yeah.
Now, the second factor that compiles into this war is one where initially the Dakota were very lucky, relatively speaking. See, when they got pushed out of their ancestral homelands into Minnesota here, they had been allowed to sell those homelands to the United States government at prices determined by the United States government, which was more than most would usually get. And you understand from my language how bad of a deal this was to begin with.
Like
Every time.
fractions of pennies on the dollar in terms of value for the land that they should have gotten. And not even to mention it was a bad deal that they signed, but they also didn't have a choice in signing, where a lot of these treaties were signed under duress, or they were outright just scammed, where someone who wasn't even in the tribal council nor chief would sign the treaty because they were friendly with the settlers or had a financial interest to gain. And the United States government went, "Oh, we have a signature," and the tribes would go, "Yeah, but that's not one of us." But
Yep.
there's a signature.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah. It literally says John Hancock. The man is dead.
Oh no! That's John Hands on Feather. Just it's like that's not a real name, but there's a signature.
Yeah. Now, there were two sales that the Dakota had to rely on, one in 1851 and one in 1858. And the Dakota initially looked at the falling game and said, okay, this is bad, but we have our backup plan. We can subsist on the annuity payments we will receive for having given this land to the U.S. government. However, as we approach 1862, it becomes increasingly clear to the Dakota that the amount of money they're receiving each year is not enough to sustain their population. It is not enough for them to subsist off of in terms of being able to buy food from neighboring towns, buy clothes, buy other things, and exist in the capitalistic society of the United States. It's not enough money.
No, and then the other issue that they tended to have, and I know we'll talk about this a lot more, is that the people that were in charge of managing the money or the annuities that they were given tended not to be always indigenous themselves, which could be an issue, or they could be just outright scammers, or sometimes all of the above, where they would steal the money. They would say, "Oh yes, here's your check for $100," when in reality the check should be for like 1,500 or some equivalent nature of that. Or they would just straight up steal the goods, the lard and the butter and the milk that was supposed to be given to the tribes, and they would take it themselves and then consequently resell it, usually to white settlers or to other people at a upmarked cost.
There was something I heard about like earlier today. I think on like one of the podcasts I was listening to about how even like in another situation in Oklahoma where they found like oil was being found there,
Oh, that's
and
the basis for Killers of the Flower Moon.
yeah,
Yeah. Which
yeah,
great
that
movie by the
situation.
way.
So yeah, where like the government said, oh, these people can't legally have money, right? That's what they told like the like natives that were living there. And so they had somebody from the Bureau of Land Management, oh, like an agent who was supposed to be working for them to manage that money, but they couldn't really spend that money either. Because remember, you know, natives don't count as Americans or as American citizens.
Till
So
1919 or 1921, one of the two.
yeah, so they had to have, their agent be in charge of all that money. And a lot of times, they would just take the money for themselves.
And a lot of times, what happened even after that was the land rights specifically were held in tribal trust, and these white settlers would marry into an indigenous family, and then their wife or spouse would mysteriously get sick and die within short succession, and leaving the land in the hands of the white landowner, who then got all the oil money. Again,
Yeah.
Killers of the Flower Moon, great movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio, covers all of that.
Yeah. And oil is not going to be involved in the Dakota.
Not
What
yet.
what will be involved in this particular fight is a famine is going to be factor number 3 for the Dakota to go to war here.
Oof.
The crops fail in the winter of 1861/62, which causes a famine among the Dakota. They not getting enough money to supplement their their farms to begin with. The game is depleting, and now the crops have failed. The Dakota are quite literally starving at this point. And all 3 of these factors are going to come together to form factor number 4, which I like to call Thomas Galbraith.
Oh no.
God, I hate this man. So, Thomas Galbraith was an Indian agent. Actual job title.
Yeah.
They still exist, by the way.
Yeah.
Bureau of Indian Affairs, PIA.
Yep. He was responsible for overseeing the U.S. Dakota obligations. Anyone guess what he did not do?
Just his obligations. His main position and title was to help hand out the food rations that I had mentioned earlier. And that was one of the things that he specifically did not do, was hand out the food rations. He did not give the food that was meant to give these starving indigenous folk any sort of way of survival.
Yep. His reasoning for withholding the food relief from the Dakota was because he wanted to hand out the food relief at the same time he handed out their annual annuity. And the annuity, it so happens, was late. It was late that year. It's 1862. The United States is embroiled in the U.S. Civil War. Things are a little slow to move around. And so rather than make 2 trips west of Minneapolis in a single year, he said, well, they can get on well enough for another few months until the check gets here. By the way, it's in August. The check is supposed to arrive at the start of the year. And it's August.
Which, you brought up the point of the war, which is a very important one. But then also, secondarily, at this time, we tend to kind of forget or not think about that this truly was like frontier land at this time. I mean, fur trading is still happening just a little bit east of here. This is truly the edge of what was considered civilization as the white settler colonials knew it. And, you know, trains were around, but they weren't nearly as efficient. It would take about 2 weeks to get from D.C. to Chicago. And to get to Minneapolis from there probably took a few more days. So it was a long trek. Not to justify any of it. The reason it was late was just because it truly admitted to themselves that the money wasn't as important to the indigenous as it was to, you know, like they claim the war effort.
Yeah, and you know, the fairness is there ain't no roads out here. But at the same time, it's August. How long are you going to wait? Because it's August by the time this goes up in flames, and the Dakota have not seen 1 penny or 1 stalk of wheat.
Which, that's another fucked up thing, and is something that doesn't get talked about a lot, is because a lot of this food aid was withheld for so long, some of the foodstuffs spoiled. So the amount that they were supposed to get was even less than what they actually did, and that was after the Indian agent tax, like I said earlier, where they skim from the top. Then you have even more rotting, and there's, by the time aid does go out, it's not good. I mean, they didn't have good food preservation techniques at the time, and like some of the stuff had a stable shelf life, but it was not going to last forever either.
Canning hadn't been around long enough, right?
No,
Yeah.
canning doesn't take off in earnest till the late 1880s.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah. Not to mention, you're probably not concerned about giving them a balanced diet or even the good stuff. So it's the day-old bread. It's day-old bread when you buy it.
It's bread, it's cheese, it's lard. Like, it's things that have some stable shelf life, but you're going to have issues if it sits, especially if it sits in any condition that wasn't dry and cool. You know, if it had any sort of moisture, mold became an issue, especially with the bread and the cheese. I mean, it wasn't a good scenario. They weren't giving them healthy food. And it's funny, we talk about generational traumas and historical issues. This is part of the reason why a lot of indigenous populations to this day have health issues, high blood pressure, because their way of life was propped up by these extremely unhealthy foods.
Yeah. And that's going to bring us to reason number 5, the Dakota go to war. This is the flashpoint reason. This is the spark that catches and ignites everything that we've talked about so far. And that's going to be the tension the Dakota were experiencing with the American trappers and settlers. See, the Dakota, in order to survive at this point, had resorted to poaching on lands claimed by white settlers. And on August 17th, 1862, at a place called Action in Meeker County, Minnesota, just immediately west of what is now Minneapolis, 4 Dakota kill 5 white trappers over a nest of birds' eggs. The Dakota, when they get back to their people, realize that now, no matter what has happened or will happen, they're going to be painted as the bad guys and face increasing punitive measures from either the local settlers or the U.S. military. So, we're off to the races.
Which, one small point of contention, and this is something that a lot of indigenous groups have gone to war with as recently as the 1980s, was in the treaties that they signed or were coerced into sign, there were land rights and hunting rights, to the point where it's not necessarily poaching. However, the white settlers felt it was poaching because they were going for the same game, when in reality the Indians had treaty rights that guaranteed them the right to hunt those lands and to fish those lands.
Yeah.
I know it's a moot point here, but it was something that does kind of boil over about a century after this.
Yeah, no, that's a good point to mention too, is that like the definition of poaching would not be what we would think of it today as, with like ivory hunting or a lot of this very expressly illegal greed-based actions. This is subsistence actions that were at least partially guaranteed by law to be allowed, but it would still get labeled as poaching.
It was hunting on private lands, which under the rules of the law at this time, like if you own the land, you own the game on it. It's kind of similar to private land rights. Like if you have no hunting posted on your land, people can't just come marching in and hunting it. They're poaching at that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a double-edged sword where these white settlers were like, hey, they're on our land stealing our food that we're struggling for. Our crops failed too, and they're just sitting there starving. The natives are.
Yeah. And so August 18th, the Dakota convene and they decide we have no recourse left. The time has come to declare war. And it's not really a war they hope to win. It's a war they hope to survive. They're declaring war in 1862 in order to make it to 1863.
It really boils down to that. I mean, they were facing those external pressures, and what happened too that we haven't mentioned on this, and sorry I keep butting in, but this is obviously a topic that I'm very passionate about. But a lot of those settlers in those areas specifically were illegally settling Indian land at the time, and they settled it in anticipation of the government coming in, signing additional treaties to grant them ownership over that land. One of the big things with homesteading at the time was you would have to improve the land. You would have to farm it for a number of years. Well, if you got a jump start on that, by the time it was opened up for settlement, you could say, hey, I've been farming this land for a decade now. Here's what I've done to improve it. And they would encroach specifically on Indian lands, knowing and partially hoping that it would provoke them into conflict with the military. It's part of the reason why it's seen as like the Indian problem. And
Yeah.
especially in western Minnesota here, pretty much anything west of the Mississippi and her headwaters is
Mhm.
effectively what was Indian land at the time that white frontier settlers would go settle, develop their farms, and then afterwards they would basically rely on the government to go, hey, we're under attack, can you please send help?
Yeah. So, like, the general reality is there should not have been any white people in Meeker County at this time,
And
but there were enough to start a fight with the Dakota.
and then of course the US government for their part go, "Oh, white people are being attacked and killed? Okay, yeah, we can't have that."
Yeah, this assault upon their sovereign homes? Oh no. Well, a little bit of good news for the Dakota is that the US response is framed by the Civil War, meaning that the main military might of the United States is somewhat distracted fighting itself. And so, what happens is the governor of Minnesota appoints a man named Henry Sibley to handle the uprising. Sibley is granted the commission of a colonel, and he is granted that commission as not as a U.S. Army officer, but as a colonel of the Minnesota Army. Because at this time, state militias were effectively an individual state's standing army. And thus, each state had its own military force wholly independent of the federal government.
Well, this was before the government consolidated that into the National Guard. But this would effectively be, if you could imagine, the National Guard, where you have armories and weaponry, and then you just have a bunch of farmers that, in a moment's notice, will pick up a rifle and go marching with you.
Yeah. Now, now Sibley is a smart man. Sibley goes on to become very accomplished. He will actually, I believe, sit in the United States Congress and argue for indigenous rights
Okay.
in the distant future. However, he's going to turn his capabilities
Mm.
on the Dakota during this time. And that's not a safe place to be. So Sibley says, all right, I'm a colonel. I'm technically the highest ranking officer of the Army of Minnesota. So I'm going to go to the 6th to 11th U.S. Infantry regiments, and I'm going to siphon those forces because those are all technically Minnesota volunteers, which means that until an officer of the United States Army arrives to collect them, they are my personnel. So he takes these people. These companies are incomplete. They are hastily assembled. They are completely untrained. And he takes 4 companies from the 6th Regiment out of Fort Snelling and takes them to St. Peter to go Indian hunting.
Hmm.
He gets sporadic support from Fort Snelling throughout his tenure here. Again, no one's in charge. He's technically the man in charge. He's not at Fort Snelling, the logistics center. So no one is really doing anything properly. They're just sort of haphazard everywhere. The operation will come under federal jurisdiction on September 16th when Major General John Pope arrives to take control of the Minnesota military and reorganize it into the United States military. John Pope recognizes the need to defend Minnesota, and so he promotes Mr. Sibley to Brigadier General of U.S. Army Volunteers, meaning that
Well,
Sibley technically still only controls the militia, but he has the authority of a general.
Oof.
what the actual fuck? They really just given that title out to anyone.
To be fair, during the U.S. Civil War, if you could recruit a certain number of people, the U.S. government would award you a commission based on that number, meaning if you could talk enough people into walking into a recruitment office, you could be handed a general star. That's how thirsty the US government is for military power right now. They are desperate during this fight. It is not good. Now, fortunately, The 4 weeks between August 18th and September 16th is sort of the window of opportunity for the Dakota. It gives them their chance to come in, inflict damage, let everyone know that what has been done to them is not okay. And they kind of do.
Oh no.
Yep. Their first target on August 18th is the Lower Sioux Agency in Morton.
Morton.
Yep. And this is their biggest victory, is the first day of the war, is their biggest victory here. They're led by Little Crow, chief of, and I sincerely apologize for my pronunciation of this, Medawakanton, Band of the Dakota. And not only does Little Crow manage to raid the Lower Sioux Agency, but he also effectively annihilates the militia force sent to trap him there.
Also, can we just talk about how fucked up it is that for him to get support and to get the stuff that was promised to them by treaty, he had to raid the agency that was in charge of handing it out.
Yep.
That's like going to the bank, breaking in just so you can withdraw your own cash, is effectively the modern
Yep.
equivalent.
Yeah. I'm robbing the bank, but only the money that's in my account.
Yeah, like, I want my money. I don't care about other people's money. And they're like, but sir, you can't do that. I didn't give you permission.
They should have called J.G. Wentworth.
That's my money and I need it now. Oh no.
Oh no. J.G. Wentworth as an Indian agent in the mid
So
18th century. Those commercials just got so much darker.
Oh, God. He probably was alive at that time.
Oh.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
wasn't
I feel
good.
bad. I feel a little bit bad. Yeah.
We're sitting here laughing and joking, but this is a very serious topic. It's hard and it's very difficult, especially in history, because a lot of it is dark. You kind of have to offset it with some humor and jokes.
Yeah.
But this was a really dark period because your people are pushed to the brink. You're struggling. You're deposed from your own homeland. You're in a different area, and you're still facing the threat of elimination. We look at it in hindsight and say, "Oh yeah, it's all Little Crow's fault." But what would you do in that instance? And I guarantee every single person would say they would fight for their survival,
Yep.
and that's what this was.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all the people who go around talking tough about fighting for freedom and standing up to oppression. Well, this is your chance. Here are your impossible odds. Here's your oppressor. Run at him. And that is what the Dakota are doing here.
And to their point and to their credit, the United States military at this point had become such a formalized fighting force that when it came to insurgent fighting like this guerrilla warfare, they weren't actually equipped to handle it. Like, and I know it's kind of ironic considering the U.S. won the Revolutionary War by similar, if not the exact same tactics of run, hit, and then run back into the woods. The second that the Dakota start doing it, they go, What are they doing that for?"
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, for the United States, not only are they a very large military force at this time, but they're also a military force with tactics behind technology, which is why during the Civil War, which is going on simultaneously with this uprising, there is such high casualties. The U.S. military tactics are unfortunately out of date, and that is going to be crushing for them for much of this decade here in the 1860s.
Well, yeah, they still fought in line formations as cannon and gunpowder would just blow their knees off.
Yeah, it was industrial weapons with Napoleonic tactics, which is not a good mix.
And also, to be fair, we talked about this a few times, but you literally have a divided military.
Yeah.
And the few experienced veteran combat fighters you have might not have made it quite this far, if you understand what I'm saying, considering the large tally of the early battles of the war.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of death here. Anyway, the Dakota get to continue their streak of success during this month-long period in which the U.S. Army is not formally involved. They hit New Ulm and Fort Ridgely with limited success. They do manage to cause a mass exodus of white settlers, of U.S. citizens, but they do not take the fort. They do not hold the territory in the traditional sense that we would think of, where they're able to maintain and then capitalize on their gains with further raids further and further into U.S. controlled territory. It's sort of able to push you off me, but not able to run you down.
Yeah.
Kind of scenario. And unfortunately, because the U.S. is so slow to respond due to the Civil War, most of the people that the Dakota are fighting are civilians. They are farmers with guns who believe that they are defending their home and their wives and their children from some sort of unprovoked barbarian invasion. And so most of the people that the Dakota kill during this fighting are civilians. They are farmers. They are hunters. They are not what we would consider today combatants. And that is very unfortunate.
And, again, part of this ties back to the manifest destiny of, it's our right and it's our God-given mission to settle these lands, to break them for our will, to farm them. And
Yeah.
it's just it's unfortunate, but that is what the public sentiment was at the time. I mean, you had the gold rush in California, the railroad being put up between them. There really was a drive and a push to connect all of America.
Yeah, and I do personally sympathize with a lot of the white settlers because even though they shouldn't have been on that land, they are being killed, not understanding what they have done or why it is wrong. And that is the part that I think hurts me most, is that they don't understand why this is happening.
I think you attribute a little too much of this.
Empathy to them.
I think so. I think you're attributing a little too much laissez-faire because, in truth, what had happened was these raids had been long going and long standing, and there was a lot of tribe members that were actually killed and slaughtered by settlers who
Yeah.
were not combatants. They were just scouts. They were gatherers that would be killed by the settlers because the settlers thought that all of the Indians in this area, all the indigenous, were violent, ruthless, because there were a lot of battles that took place where the trophy taking was very prominent.
Yeah.
So that.
Oh yeah,
And,
we definitely do get into that later at the end of this, very much unfortunately. But I do see what you're saying, and it's just one of those things. Just like, I like to believe that at the end of the day, the people were just people
I
on
do
both sides of this, and it just hurts me because this is a constant bloody canvas that is the American frontier. It is just constant blood,
I
and
do agree that there were a lot of innocent people that were caught in the
yeah,
crosshairs.
yeah, it's bad. But anyway, with that, are you ready to go to the triumphant victory of the manifest destiny of the God-given American people? Because that is unfortunately our next section, because nothing can work out for the Native Americans for very long here.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
Yeah.
So there is one major battle in this uprising. It is the Battle of Wood Lake, and it is the decisive blow. This is where General Sibley catches up with the main Dakota raiding force, and the two sides have it out. It takes place in Wood Lake, Yellow Medicine County on September the 23rd. And the Dakota are annihilated. It's a decisive U.S. victory. The military might of the Dakota is broken. Most of the survivors flee into Canada or into what is known as Dakota Territory at the time, which would just be further west, out of Minnesota. And the few that don't are those who are trying to get the women and children out. There are those with families who are trying to escort the rest of the village out before General Sibley can find them. Fun fact, he finds them.
Yeah, and he does a lot worse to them.
Well, not initially. 3 days after this battle, he catches them all, rounds them up, accepts the surrender of the Dakota people as sort of the quote-unquote end of the war, and he proceeds to hold all of them hostage at Fort Snelling for the next 3 months.
Which, Fort Snelling, not a great place to be. It was a frontier fort, again, which meant that it didn't have the amenities. It wasn't, a Camp David. It wasn't a retreat. It was an internment camp, effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, now Snelling accepts the surrender of the Dakota at a place called Camp Release, where the Dakota released 300 captured U.S. civilians that they had taken hostage themselves during the raids. These people are returned, and then approximately 1,600 Dakota are taken into U.S. custody.
Because that's an equivalent exchange.
Because that's everyone who's still there. Now, Snelling ends up being part of what is known as the Military Commission. This is the first order of business. Or sorry, Sibley. No, sorry, Snelling is a place. Sibley is a person. Sibley ends up being a part of the Military Commission, which is one of arguably the most illegal trials in history. The Military Commission takes place over the 3 weeks following Camp Release, and it is a trial of 392 Dakota men who are believed to have participated in some form or another in the raids of the uprising. 303 of these men are sentenced to death. Most of the trials last a grand total of 5 minutes maximum, with the rights to a defense and the rights to legal counsel waived for the entirety of the defendants. The Dakota are not granted those rights.
Which they weren't also granted translators either, a people that had their own unique language, and many of whom did not speak English.
Yeah. The legality of this commission is almost immediately questioned. So much so that while it is happening, someone decides to send its transcripts via the telegram to Abraham Lincoln, objecting to the practices occurring here.
Good.
Lincoln reads the whole thing and orders a stay of execution for all but 39 men, whom, as I understand it, the evidence against them was actual evidence.
Which, fair. If there were 39 actual participants, it's fair if they got... I mean, it's not fair that they had a kangaroo court or, these bullshit trials, but if there was actual precedence or actual evidence or, anything that could link them, I do understand that. I wouldn't expect a blanket pardon for everyone, but to sentence over 300 people to death.
Yeah. The commission appears to have been under the idea of kill every male Dakota between the ages of 16 and 60.
AKA the reproducing population. That's their usual go-to.
What were considered enemy combatants and hostile. And it's like, you just sort of look at that and go, that's not how a human population works.
Yeah, it's just it's disappointing because, and I know a lot of people have different opinions about this, but you would hope that the institution would have some sort of rigid ethics or guidelines, and that just never is the case.
Yeah, the ethics is Abraham Lincoln, who, when word gets out that he is going to make this decision, he is heavily lobbied to let them die. but he is Abraham fucking Lincoln. And he does not take this sort of crap from anyone.
Well, and the thing I like about that specifically is you hear about a lot of these great people in history that do incredible things or that work to help a specific disadvantaged group. Very rarely do those same people kind of universally apply those rules and ethics, unfortunately. It's
Yeah.
part of the reason why, like, women gain the right to vote before most indigenous.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
to see him practicing what he eventually did preach does send some good guidance, and this also came to at a point where most U.S. politicians, both at the federal and state levels, almost across the country, all passed anti-indigenous legislation. It this was in one of the worst periods where again the external pressures on a lot of tribes both in the US or well, in what was the US and then in the Indian Territory really boiled over. I mean, it was only 20 years prior to this that the Trail of Tears wrapped up in the American South.
Ah, yes, Jackson.
Like we think about history as these large gaps in time, but in reality, the Trail of Tears didn't wrap up till the late 1840s.
Yeah, Trail of Tears officially ends at 1850. So this has been it's been 12 years since the conclusion of the Trail of Tears.
And like that doesn't also account for all of the tribes in New England that continuously had their tribal lands and reservations whittled away until nothing. Like it's universally just shit, quite frankly.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of universally shit, Fort Snelling.
Yeah.
Yep. Fort Snelling holds 1,658 Dakota. Most of them are women and children. An additional 1,600 women, children, and elderly are also held at Pike Island, which is within sight of Fort Snelling. And it's sort of like splitting a community in half and then watching which side will die first. It's the Joker in The Dark Knight trying to blow up the two ferries. It's literally what's happening here.
Yeah.
As both sides are held in was effectively a concentration camp, which is just um, a roofless pit, and disease kills several hundred of them. I don't have the numbers for the ones who die on Pike Island, but some 300 die from disease at Fort Snelling.
Which we talk about how disease runs rampant through these camps, but it was almost fully intentional. I mean,
Yeah.
you shove 1,600 people in a space that can traditionally accommodate 100 people uncomfortably.
Yeah, and
I remember
it's
the stories
about
of like uh the smallpox blanket stuff.
yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, that yeah. Yeah, but this is about 20% of the population you have held dies from neglect. That is either you are a miraculously terrible planner or you are doing this on purpose.
Yep.
Yeah.
Lovely.
The Dakota are removed from Fort Snelling and they are sent to Crow Creek, South Dakota in May of 1863. And that's going to bring us to the last big section here, which is the general aftermath and human cost of what has happened. This is going to be both the casualty rate and all that legislation Justin mentioned that follows in the wake of this uprising, because the United States is determined to never let another Native American group threaten them ever again. Fun fact, no.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, we'll start off with the U.S. side here. About 600 U.S. settlers are killed, which is just shy of the 615 Minnesotans killed in the 4 years of the Civil War. So this was a hefty impact for the force the Dakota were wielding. A hefty impact. The Dakota, on the other hand, see 100 killed in combat, 39 executed for the uprising, and between 130 and 300, we're going with 300 here because underreporting is very much a thing. 300 in captivity at Fort Snelling. The Dakota caused 20,000 U.S. settlers to flee their homes. This is the largest of any uprising. So, number one there, congratulations, Little Crow. You were arguably the most terrifying Native American war chief, since you scared more people away than anyone else.
Which, like I said, they were fairly vicious, and this ends up coming full circle yet again because the U.S. goes, hey, that's a good idea. We should borrow this. In that, it was very common practice for the Dakota to take war trophies, aka scalps of people that they fought in battle. So they would scalp a lot of the people that they did kill and keep them as trophies. And what did the U.S. decide to do to that, Colum? Let's go into that.
So what did the USA do? Well, Congress starts passing wave after wave of legislation aimed at mitigating Native American rights.
And so, just a continuation of their former policies, obviously.
Yep, but now with an excuse to be absolutely explicit about it. Act number one, which is my personal favorite out of all of the actions that get taken here, is the Dakota Expulsion Act. And the reason it's my favorite is because of the absolute scorched earth level of thoroughness that Congress goes through to make sure that the Dakota are forever disadvantaged.
Yeah.
There have several provisions in here. Provision number one: all treaties with the Dakota are null and void, meaning the United States government can do whatever it wants to the Dakota people at any time without consequence.
And also meant that all of those deals that they made selling the land were thus invalid, which ties all the way back to a modern movement, which is the land back movement, because they don't have any legal jurisdiction over the land if there's no treaty. But then it also meant the United States government no longer had to provide those provisions to the tribes, nor their annuities.
Yep.
So they were no longer, they're like, all right, well, we don't have to pay you our debts anymore.
Yep. And the second key provision here, which is what makes the Expulsion Act my personal favorite for everything it implies, is they made it illegal for any Dakota to ever, under any circumstances, live in Minnesota. And this law is still on the books today. There has been nothing done to repeal this part or override this part with new legislation, which means that right now, in 2024, it is illegal to be Dakota in Minnesota.
Granted, that's one of those that's no longer fully enforced, but maybe that's a petition we start. We repeal the Expulsion Act.
Yep. Yep. This law applied to all Dakota, regardless of involvement in the uprising, and it mandates that any Dakota found in Minnesota be expelled to the Crow Creek Reservation in South Dakota.
Yeah.
This is bad, but yeah, we should definitely start a thing to just repeal this act because this is a level of stupid pettiness that needs to no longer exist.
Well, and that's not even the worst part, in my opinion, because along with that, they also ended up expelling the Ho-Chunk and Winnebago people, which had been living peacefully at Blue Earth with the Dakota, and they were expelled to Crow Creek as well. And this is part of Minnesota's desire to remove all Native Americans from the state at this time. But the irony in it is the Ho-Chunk and Winnebago people. Do you know where they originally had their homes, their lands?
I believe they were nomadic people living in the Winnebago car, from which
Oh
they
my
derived
God.
their name.
No, they're from Wisconsin. They moved to Minnesota after Wisconsin had a huge wave of settlers push them outward. Thankfully,
Yeah.
since then, the Ho Chunk have reestablished tribal reservations. The Winnebago, I'm not as sure. I don't believe they
As,
do.
as far as I could understand, the Ho Chunk and Winnebago were effectively the same people. There was some light differentiation, but for the most part, it seems to be two names for the same group. I could be wrong. Sources are very limited on this. So if you know, please tell us.
So the Winnebago
Please.
is one of these subdivisions of Ho Chunk, but they
Yeah.
are a different identified group, and their tribal reservation is in Nebraska now.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah. There is this distinction, but they are a joint. They are a what is it? Part of the same family.
Yeah, which a lot of tribe groups, specifically, why they get classified under similar names is actually usually because of language. It tends
Yeah.
to be language derivative, especially with Dakota, because there's like 8 different sub tribes of Dakota, Santee being one of them.
Yeah.
But it's all because you speak the same language from the same language tree that they get classified together. Plus, we also get a lot of exonyms like Dakota and Sioux are exonyms for the groups.
Yeah. Yeah. Is also why the Navajo exist entirely as their own thing because nothing sounds like Navajo.
No, and the group that they think they relate to is the Anasazi, which Anasazi is Navajo for enemy ancestor. Again, another exonym. A lot of tribes will use exonyms.
Yeah. Yeah, which is very very fun there. Um yeah. The third thing that the United States Congress does, in addition to expelling the Dakota and then expelling the Ho Chunk and Winnebago, is they place what is known as a Dakota scalping bounty. This is a bounty that is technically placed on just the Dakota, but applies to any and all Native American found within the boundaries, air quotes, of Minnesota.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, people might suddenly become very bad with geography in looking to cash in on this. In fact, we're going to talk about one man in a little bit, a man named Mackenzie, who becomes so bad he invades Canada.
Well, for certain causes, but this was one of the things that I wanted to bring up earlier is how the Sioux were so prominent in their scalping and war trophies that the U.S. government goes, "Hey, that's a great idea," and in turn places a bounty on anyone who collects the scalps of Native Americans that enter Minnesota. And to keep going even further on that, Little Crow, who had organized the uprising, his scalp and a number of his bones were captured and kept in 1863. And one small point of clarification on this next point column is
Yep.
Little Crow's scalp was kept on display at the Minnesota Historical Society, I believe, until 1915. I think after 1915 they put it in their collection, but they still kept it until 1971.
Yeah. You could be right about that. The only dates I found was that it was taken and put on display in 1863, and then in 1971 it was returned and and interred at a I believe familial plot in Flandreau, South Dakota.
Yeah, so they finally did eventually return the scalp, but they kept it on display for at least 50 years.
Yeah.
And that's
And then
really,
kept it till like for like another 60.
yeah,
Yeah.
which beyond fucked up, one. And the other fucked up part, and I don't know if you came across this in the research column, but did you ever get a chance to see how it was displayed?
No, I did not get a chance to see how it was displayed. I'm kind of glad about that because I don't really like the whole display of human remains. I will accept remains within a coffin, casket, or urn, but never on display themselves.
So they had basically pinned the scalp, which was just that slice of hair, basically.
Yeah.
They mounted it on top of a dream catcher. and they put bones around with it. So they had not just his scalp, but they also had his bones, his remains, on the catcher or like scattered around it.
Okay, that's not a museum display. That's an attempt to summon something unspeakable.
Well, that's a war trophy if I've ever heard of one of.
Yeah, yeah, that's straight. Yeah, straight up war trophy.
Yeah.
So it just, oh yeah, that you can't really apologize for that. There's very little apologetics that could take place. They did that for a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
you gotta take the L on that one.
The only apology offers these people were monsters and we condemn them entirely. We no longer acknowledge their existence as human. Because dear fucking god, that is messed up.
But then on the flip side, if you bring us one of their scalps, we'll reward you.
Yeah. Speaking of holding a grudge for way too long, the US decides that even though the uprising's done and they've successfully deported all of the Dakota, they've decided that they're going to take a page out of the British Army's book and spend the next 2 years launching punitive expeditions. So in 1863 and 64, the United States military leaves Fort Snelling to go shoot Dakota in Dakota.
Yeah.
They then capture some of the Dakota who don't die from the shooting and can't run away, bring them back to Fort Snelling, punish them for being in Minnesota now, and deport them back to Crow Creek.
Well, to some degree, part of that was just to put them on the reservation, and it's one of those things of most tribal reservations are in such remote areas, so far from population centers, that it wasn't so much that they're just putting them there, so much as they're like keeping them away,
Yeah.
which equally fucked up in a lot of the sense. But jeez.
Yeah. And then with this, we're going to get to the last thing that the United States does to sort of respond to the uprising. This is the capstone for the entire affair, and that is the abduction of Little Six and Medicine Bottle. Now, Little Six and Medicine Bottle are both leaders of the Medewakanton Band of Dakota, same band as Little Crow. They both arguably would have played a role in the uprising, given their association with the man who led it. Fun fact, they live in Canada, which means that the US doesn't have jurisdiction. But damn, if only they taught geography here in America, we might not have gone there.
No, and that's where history revisionists like to say, "Oh, they just didn't know. They weren't sure." No, they knew damn well, because they timed their raids up into Canada to coincide where the Canadian government just kind of went, "We're gonna go over here for a little bit, eh?"
Well, actually, it's actually way more insidious than this. You see, the man involved is an American named John Mackenzie. Now, John Mackenzie had friends who lived in Minnesota and were part of the Army. And it just so happened that John Mackenzie lived in the same area that Little Six and Medicine Crow had fled to. So one day, he receives a letter saying, "Hey, if you could drag these two men across the border for us, we'll pay you money. Dear old friend, could you do it?" So he gets some of his friends together, drugs the two tribal chiefs, drags them across the border, and throws them at Fort Snelling.
Yeah, it effectively was just a kidnapping. And while we're talking about those two leaders specifically, they kidnapped like 100 people, if not more. They kidnapped quite a few.
Yeah, Little Six and Medicine Bottle get attention here because they are the big names. They are the leadership that this happens to. There are numerous others who did not hold rank, who were just ordinary people that this happens to.
Or there's even a few cases where they are just straight up Canadian First Nations people.
Yep.
There
Because
wasn't a distinction. They go, are you Sioux? No. Are you Native? Yeah. Okay, come with me.
yeah, it's one of those things where like the United States military at this time, when it comes to Native American affairs, has notoriously bad aim and absolutely no desire to improve.
Yeah.
Anyway, uh, Little Six and Medicine Bottle are tried without representation, pretty similar to the previous military commission trials of that Abraham Lincoln had to intervene on to stop them from just killing everybody. Now, what's interesting is that both Little Six and Medicine Bottle were allowed representation, but the pool of lawyers they were allowed to choose from consisted entirely of men who refused to so much as hear the case of an Indian.
Part of that issue is they chose lawyers and representatives that were nearby, you know, nearby to the areas where the tribes were raiding.
Yep. Yep.
So,
Now, the trials for these two does take longer than the military commission trials because it's an actual trial. However, all evidence is circumstantial and third hand accounts. The nearest account that I could find in the research of this was a person saying that they had heard another person claim to have heard the story of that person overhearing Medicine Bottle and Little Six bragging about what a good time they were having with Little Crow in the year of 1862. That is the hardest evidence levied against these two men. Naturally, both men plead not guilty, and naturally, both men are found guilty and sentenced to die.
yeah. Again, no translators, no people to help them.
Yeah. There is one person who helps them. There is one man, and I can't remember his name. I didn't write it down, unfortunately, because he was very much a side note in all this. But in drafting their final defense, in order to get it down in English, they do get help from one man who helps, I believe, Medicine Bottle write his final defense, where he argues that he is a citizen of Canada and that his abduction from Canada by members of the United States invalidates this trial on account of the fact that he is not a part of that he does not fall under your jurisdiction to try.
Which, even further, it wasn't until they became citizens in like the 1920s that most of the Indians were not considered U.S. citizens.
Yeah. Yeah. And that basically amounts to his argument. I live in Canada. I am not a citizen of the United States of America. The United States Army does not have the authority to try me.
And it,
Unfortunately for him, the men who have to sign off on his execution are General Sibley and then President Andrew Johnson, both of which do.
which Johnson, for the record, was a Southern Democrat. He was a Unionist. He wasn't a secessionist, but he held a lot of very conservative Southern values, of which we mentioned how the Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, wasn't that far removed, so he had a lot of anti-Indian sentiment. Not to
Yeah.
mention, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Johnson also fought in some of the wars.
Yeah, I'm not entirely certain on the history of President Johnson. Um, but I do know that upon the execution of Little Six and Medicine Bottle, Mackenzie is awarded 1,000 United States dollars for his service to the nation. God damn.
Oh, okay. I found Johnson. Johnson wasn't military, but he was the key proponent behind the Homestead Act of 1857.
Oh, yay. The Homestead Act is that act which is what is causing all these white people to keep appearing in indigenous lands for about the next 50 years.
Yeah, like I said, they were encroaching, setting up shop, and part of the Homestead Act was you had to improve the land, farm it for like 5 years.
Yeah.
Whew, so we could see why Johnson may have signed off on that, given his previous biases.
Yeah. Yeah, no, these fuckers are like the sea. You push one back, another wave comes.
And yet, for
Yeah,
whatever
American
reason, you
sentiment.
still live in the basement. But I think that's. Well, did you mention that Mackenzie got paid for his service?
Yeah, yeah, I mentioned that upon the execution, he received $1,000 for serving the nation, also known as illegalized kidnapping.
And that is yet
Bad.
another war crime that the United States commits in the name of protecting her homeland.
It's not even hers at this point, but she's protecting it.
And on that note, I think this is a great point for us to wrap up today's podcast. Thank you guys for watching. Let us know your thoughts down below, and we will see you in the next one.